we've got 20 questions already. Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest in the UKICE Changing Europe Unlock series. I'm going to do that really annoying thing now and say, my guest tonight needs no introduction, and then introduce him. It's Professor Sir John Curtice, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. He's also a Senior Fellow with UKICE Changing Europe. Basically worked with us from the start, haven't you?
I have indeed, yes. It's one of the most prescient decisions I think I've ever known the Economic and Social Research Council make. It actually decided to start you before the 2015 election.
Yep.
We officially started on the 1st of May, about 2 days before the election. And then, of course, David Cameron won the overall majority he never anticipated, and the rest is history.
Indeed. What he didn't say is it's been the best 10 years of his career working with us, but it was implied in his answer. Now, I regret to say I have lost a battle before this evening. John and I agree on many things, and the one thing we fell out about at a conference recently was we were in a room like this, and I said to the audience, even if you're in the room, I want you to put your questions on Slido so it's a level playing field between people in the room and people watching online. And John said, if you've got people in the room, let them speak. So even though it goes against all my instincts, because I like to be in control, we have got roving mics, and I will say two things to you. Firstly, and don't abuse this, if you hear something and have a pressing point or question or clarification you would like, stick your hand up and I'll try and squeeze you in. And we'll try and take a few questions from the audience as we go and be as inclusive as we can. But let's just see how we get on, because I've got hundreds of questions to ask as well. So if that's okay.
So that means please ask lots of questions so he doesn't have to ask me so many.
Well, it kind of does. But for those online, stick it in the Slido. We will do some of the Slido questions. We've got a huge number of Slido questions already, which is scary. And on Slido as well, if you vote for the questions you want me to ask, they will pop to the top of my screen and make my life a lot easier. So I'm not going to do the long introduction I've got here for you, but I want to ask you, what's your first memory of a British election?
1964. When Howard Wilson won a narrow majority over Sir Alec Douglas-Hume. I remember, in those days the polls closed at 9, and I remember so I was what, age 9 coming on 10? No, I was 10 coming on 11. And my parents allowed me to stay up to watch the first hour of the election night programme. And then, of course, actually it was very close, and we weren't sure for quite a while. In those days, many more constituencies counted on the Friday rather than counting overnight. So it was unclear throughout for quite a while on Friday whether Wilson was going to get his majority or not. I was actually out, but I remember certainly listening to the radio on that Friday following the election results. So that's my first memory.
I was so hoping you were going to add there that I said to my mum as she forced me to go to bed, I'm going to do that one day.
Nothing, you were joking, completely joking.
So apparently you and Tony Blair were contemporaries at Oxford. Did you know him? Did you meet him?
No? Tony Blair, so as I understand it, played in bands, and I never went to gigs, and Tony Blair never did politics, so I'm afraid our paths never crossed.
Fair play. Different worlds. I think it's true to say you've now covered for the BBC every general election since 1979.
Correct.
So this coming one's your 11th.
Yes.
Is there one that stands out in your memory? Is there one that you remember more fondly or less fondly?
I mean, it's the one that's probably true of most people in this room of any kind of reasonable age, which is 1997. The point about the election night on 1997 was, of course, the drama that indeed became the title of the book, which was The Downfall of Michael Portillo. But the particular reason why I remember it is that I had at that stage, working for the BBC as a producer was Sean O'Grady, who has long since been a commentator on The Independent. And I got to know Sean when he was a producer on the Record. So Sean was in charge of me on election night. And his job essentially was to keep on prodding me to offer pearls of wisdom that the programme could use, right? And when Portillo lost, I said to Sean, sit down, shut up. We're not going to get anything on air for the next 2 hours. This is the story. It's the drama of the night. And nobody, frankly, is going to care about whether or not the swing was slightly bigger in Enfield than it was in Camden.
Interesting. Prescient as well. Now, I mean, a lot of people in our profession of academia feel uncomfortable with media work. I'm going to assume you don't. But just reflecting on that relationship between academics and the media, how well do we do as a profession, do you think, in engaging with the media? What could we be done better? And what, if you like, it always strikes me there's something a bit wrong with the incentives in academia. We're incentivized to do stuff that is incomprehensible rather than stuff that's comprehensible, especially for younger academics. And you know, how could we improve on that? Should we?
Well, let me just go back to the beginning of your premise. I mean, the truth is, so I became a graduate student in 1976. And look, you know, crucial thing to realise is that my supervisor was David Butler, who, of course, had been on the telly since 1955, 1951, I think. So in those days, anybody and everybody, but of course there weren't that many of them, who was involved in, broadly speaking, the area of psephology. So David Butler, Michael Steed, who was the first person I collaborated with, David Denver at the University of Lancaster, one or two others, but that was it. But the point was, they all did media. So this wasn't the exception, it was the rule, right? So that relatively small group of people who were interested in the elections and politics in the UK, basically the media were all using them in one way or another. And to that extent, at least, nobody had to create an incentive structure. It kind of was an unwritten part of the job, right? You're right. You know, one of the problems with what's it now called, the research assessment exercise, or the REF, or whatever it's called, the problem is that the scientists got control of it. And again, you know, when I started as an academic, basically the only things that people put into academic journals were things they couldn't find anywhere else to publish. And that the principal form of dissemination was via books, either complete books or indeed edited volumes. And that was the principal way in which we communicated profession, which also meant it was also, relatively speaking, available to the public. But when the REF came in, the scientists determined the criteria because for them, communication via peer review was already the norm, and that was the norm that was, in a sense, then effectively transferred into the rest of it. And I remember having arguments with scientists about all of this. But what that, of course, meant is, therefore, the incentive structure became to publish in relatively obscure academic journals and not to communicate with the outside world, which, of course, why eventually, when the penny dropped, we then add to the whole exercise impact, because having discovered that what they'd done was to create something that made academia much more self-referential than it had been, then somebody's, hang on, we don't know what these guys are doing, and are we getting value for money? So now we try to create another incentive on top of the existing incentive, which goes in one direction, in order to try and persuade people to engage with the outside world in some way or another. But that is the environment that we create. Now, I mean, academics vary in their comfort with which they deal with the media. I think, for some, they're either afraid of being misquoted or being abused, intellectually, that is, or that the nuances of their arguments are not going to be fully developed. What I always try to explain to academics is that essentially the intellectual task of dealing with the media is actually very, very similar to the intellectual task of writing a good journal article. The intellectual task of a good journal article is that you come up with, if you're doing something empirical, a body of evidence that addresses a theoretical proposition or one or more theoretical propositions in the literature, and you then are testing various aspects of those theoretical propositions with your evidence, right? So your criteria of relevance are theory, and what theory anticipates, all right? The criteria for the media are news values, which is about who's up, who's down, and in particular, it's much more forward-looking. It's about who might benefit, who might lose. Now, but it's still the same thing. The point is that there are a set of criteria there that help to determine what matters and what is deemed to be relevant. So if you can do the one, vis-a-vis academic relevance, intellectually, you should be able to do the other. You just need to realise that you might want to look at the same body of evidence through a different prism in order to be able to communicate it to via conventional media or to the wider public. Now, of course, one of the things, of course, which has changed now much more recently, of course, I mean, quite a lot of academics are very good at using social media and the web, etc., etc. And I think the truth is, of course, that does mean, therefore, that whereas in my day, if you were going to do anything vis-a-vis the outside world, you had to operate through what we now call the conventional media. To be honest now, if you want us to put things up on the web, and I do that as well, I also run websites and do this stuff as well. But if you want
and you're on Twitter.
Yeah, and I'm on Twitter. And so you can put things up directly if you want. And I tend to use it, indeed, like lots of academics, to put up stuff that I think, it's not going to make the pages of not even the Financial Times. It's too complicated or too abstruse, but actually may be of interest to the kinds of people who turn up to meetings like this.
Okay. That's a compliment.
Somewhat unusual as you are.
Do you worry at all about the line between analysis and commentary? That sometimes in a desire to keep the media happy, there's a danger of straying away from a strict analysis of the data there onto opinionising?
Well, I would say two things. One is I refuse to do things if I don't feel I have expertise in the area.
That's the opposite of me.
Well, no, Andy, your expertise is much more wide-ranging than mine. That's right. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, I always like to be able to cite at least a piece of evidence in support of anything that I claim. Now, that sometimes can get journalists or broadcasters somewhat annoyed because it's kind of getting into the kind of detail they don't necessarily want. And I am certainly very wary of, I mean, to be honest, there are a number of times, I say something or whatever on air, and then all of a sudden I see it's here, there, and everywhere. John Curtice says this, and I go, that's not news, guys. The fact that I might say something is irrelevant. If you wonder what, therefore, that actually makes me more wary about what I say without making sure that I've got the evidence, because I'm perfectly well aware that what I say gets picked up far too widely. Speaking of which, all right, you know what's coming now. Yeah, I know what's coming now. There were lots of newspaper stories recently about you saying there's a 99% chance of Labour forming the next government. It was widely covered, and I sat there wondering, I wonder where that comes from. Where did that come from? Well, I should say, first of all, it's not the first time I'd said it in the public domain. Indeed, I had said it on one or two broadcasts I'd done. But the answer is this. I was giving an academic lecture at the Political Studies Association annual conference. Political Studies Association is the principal professional organisation for political scientists in the UK. It happened to be taking place in my university, so I and Elsa Anderson from the University of Edinburgh were being asked to do a joint keynote. And somewhere along in the Q&A, if you think academics just ask theoretical questions, forget it. I mean, the questions were going all about what's going to happen and what do you think about this or that or whatever. And somewhere along the way, I kind of said, well, look, there's basically a 99% chance that the Labour Party will form the next administration. Now, of course, the trouble is these days, and this goes back to academics, obviously somebody decided to put it on Twitter. I don't know who, I haven't bothered to go through the trail. But yes, indeed, I was then going off to dinner, and by the time I was walking off to dinner, my phone was buzzing with 2 or 3 people, and they were saying, well, why are you saying that, blah, blah, blah. And of course, 1 or 2 people were beginning to misinterpret, because what I very, very carefully said was not that there was a 99% chance of Labour winning the election. It was that there was a 99% of Labour forming the next government. And those 2 things are not the same thing. Because essentially what I was putting together is 2 things. One is, so take where the polls are at the moment, okay? 19-point Labour lead. What is the biggest narrowing of the lead in the polls from 8 months out before polling day and polling day? The 8 months, the narrowing in the polls, right? The end point is not what the election result was. The end point is what were the polls saying. And the biggest reversal in a full-length parliament, you have to do it in a full-length parliament because otherwise the Prime Minister has chosen the date and therefore, that confounds things. So the answer to that is 2010. The Labour's leader, the Conservatives' leader over Labour narrowed by 6 points from 8 months out before 2010 and polling day. Right?
Yeah.
So let's take 6 points off the Labour lead. Now let's also add to that. So we're already taking one extreme, right? Now let's also add the biggest mess up in the polling industry, which is 1992, when they overestimated Labour's position vis-à-vis Conservatives by 9%. That still gets us a 4-point Labour lead. Then comes the crucial point, which is a 4-point Labour lead, well, almost undoubtedly hung Parliament territory, but hung Parliament territory that is probably the Tories blow about 315. And then you have to remember the Conservatives are very short of friends inside the House of Commons. We know the Liberal Democrats will not vote for a Conservative King's Speech. We know the SNP will not vote for a Conservative King's Speech. Maybe the DUP will, but whether or not they'll be able to do a deal in current circumstances, etc., who knows? So the point is, it's an asymmetric contest. Unless the Conservatives are at or very close to 326, they will not form the next government. And that's how you get to... So you take an extreme narrowing of the lead, an extreme polling error, and then take into account the parliamentary politics. You still don't get to a situation where the Conservatives form the next government.
So what you're saying is someone leaked it, but you were absolutely right anyway.
No, I mean, history is always there to be, historical records are always there to be broken. But the point is, you're going to have to break at least one or other of 2 quite significant historical records in order to get to a point where maybe the Conservatives might be able to sustain administration.
Okay, I'm going to do...
I mean, by the way, this is partly the legacy of Brexit. Why the Liberal Democrats won't maintain a minority Conservative administration because of Brexit. The SNP will not vote for... So the point is, it's fine for the Tories to have corralled the Leave vote all behind them in 2019. That was their great victory card. But it's also their weakness in terms of parliamentary politics. Okay,
there's a slightly embarrassing little bit of a fanboy section coming up with the questions now, just because I'm quite curious about the ins and outs of how you do the exit poll. So, I mean, first, you just talk us through the work that goes into the exit poll, and when do you start preparing for it? How,
already started.
Okay, when did you start, and as it gets closer, sort of, is it full time?
We started, I think, October, November time.
Okay, and what is the work you're doing sort of technical stuff, or is it more practical stuff, sort of looking at polling stations?
It's technical, practical stuff is the answer to you. So, I mean, to explain, the crucial feature of the exit poll isn't one exit poll, it's 2 exit polls. Because the methodology the problem we have in the United Kingdom is that we don't have what people in the States would call precinct level counts. Right? In most countries, before anybody would ever dare to allow a ballot box leave the polling station, they would want the votes to be counted. Because the moment it leaves the polling station, who knows what might happen to it on the way to its supposed destination. Maybe it won't make it, maybe it will get stuffed, etc., right? So for most countries, that is a crucial goal. Now, in our case, we go, oh, it's fine. We'll put a ballot box and a boat between E-Day and the mainland on Orkney in the middle of winter, and it's absolutely fine. We have a little policeman on it to make sure things are okay. And we expect all these ballot papers happily to arrive, unstuffed, safe arrival, right? Because when the Victorians decided to set the rules, and we're still following the Victorian rules, what they were concerned about is that if you had precinct-level counts, in those days, not many people had the vote because of the franchise, you'd be able to work out who voted for whom. Right. So it's actually therefore one of the... So this is the reason why, if any of you have ever been to a count, you may want to know, well, why is it they mix the ballot papers through all the polling stations before they start the count? It's to stop people supposedly being able to work out
Right.
voted. Although, of course, all the parties are watching the verification, and they can get a pretty good idea how the polling stations have worked. And in fact, now in Scotland, for STV elections, they do actually publish the data. So anyway, that creates a problem, because therefore, any exit poll is a sample of a relatively small number of polling stations. And it's impossible in the UK to come up with a sample of polling stations that you know are representative. Elsewhere you can do it. Now, and the person here who deserves the credit is David Firth, who's a statistician at the University of Warwick, who had, for a while, been working on the prediction programme for the UK.
He's from Wakefield, by the way. Right, go on.
And David's crucial piece of advice was this, well, look, sure, the level of support for the parties varies dramatically from one constituency to another. Mm-hmm. But the change in support doesn't vary anything like so much. So therefore, it's easier to estimate the change in share than it is the level of share, okay? And that, so long as you then model the data thereafter, which is what we do, pretty much any sample of polling stations will do. But of course, what you therefore need is information on how that polling station voted at the last election. Where does that information come from? Ideally, the last exit poll. So what the technical work we're engaged in at the moment, of course, is that unfortunately, returning officers change the boundaries of polling districts occasionally. And so there's a lot of work going on at the moment, find where is it changed, can we still go back there anyway because it's still sufficiently similar, or are we going to have to go to somewhere else? And then Roger Mortimer of Ipsos Mori, who's very, very good at this, gets a load of data together, and we try to find a new polling station that's typical of the constituency, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So the point, therefore, why we're already doing preparatory work is that work of, has the polling station, well, first of all, is it still the same polling station, or if they move the polling station, can we still put interviewers outside there? And has the polling district changed significantly or not? And then also, we may also want to do some work adjusting the sample. That's the kind of work that's going on at the moment. And it's kind of really detailed, nose-grinding work, but it's crucial.
And how big is your team then? It sounds like there's a huge amount of preparatory work. So how big is the exit poll team?
Well, I mean, on the analysis side, 1, 2, 3, 4, about half a dozen of us. But most of the work at this stage is being done by myself and 2 or 3 people in Ipsos.
Okay, this is actually the question I really want the answer to, which is at what time do you have your number, and how many people know before 10 o'clock?
We get data continuously throughout the day.
All right.
And usually, I mean, the data do move, but basically Labour voters have come out somewhat later. But usually we pretty much know what's going to happen by 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
And you never text me?
Because I hate to disappoint you, and I could end up in jail for doing so, right? It's against the law to publish any information based on how people have actually voted before 10 o'clock on polling day. So the answer to your second question, as few people as possible, as late as possible, because we basically don't want it to leak. And we go, I mean, there are all sorts of security procedures which I won't go into, but one thing I will tell you is I do not have this on polling day. Once we go into the exit poll room, nobody who has access to the data has this, and we give them all to a BBC producer. And the only call that anybody is allowed to accept is to their partner saying, "I'm terribly sorry, but I've just thrown our baby into the river." And that conversation has to take place in front of a witness. But otherwise, basically, we cannot be contacted. And that's not because I don't trust my colleagues. It's because it's protection, because I, therefore, am always able to, because occasionally things do shall we say, circulate rather more widely than desirable in the last 15 minutes or so, I can always say hand on heart, it wasn't us, because we didn't have any means of distributing it.
I've got all these images of a sort of Oscars-style envelope being opened by you in some darkened room at the moment. But
No, it's a bit more prosaic than that.
so, I mean, I know you didn't do an exit poll, but for a pollster, what's the difference with doing a referendum, between doing a referendum and a general election? Is a referendum easier? Is it harder? Are there methodological issues for you in your role?
No, it's pretty similar, at least in terms of forecasting the outcome, which we've got the results coming in. I mean, in the case of the Brexit referendum, we kind of had a rule to ourselves, which was, don't rock the pound. Don't rock the pound. I mean, ITN, I think in Sky, we all did roughly the same thing, which is that basically, because the relationship between how people were going to vote in Brexit was so strongly demographically structured, it was possible to produce demographic models where you basically could say, well, you know, in this local authority, what we did is what we said, what do we expect the result to be in every local authority? It was literally, it was a dead heat. And that then gave you a benchmark. And in a sense, I mean, the only justification of an exit poll is to give you a benchmark at the top of the night.
Yeah.
So you can therefore begin to make sense of the results as they come in. And in a sense, it doesn't matter whether the exit poll is right or wrong. It gives you a benchmark, and the point is, if the exit poll is wrong, it still enables you to understand what the early results are telling you. So again, this was an alternative kind of benchmark. What would you expect? It was a 50-50 outcome. Now, in a sense, it's easier because you're only trying to estimate one number, right? And two, what you're not having to deal with is the whole problem under our electoral system of saying, well, even if you get the votes right, you're not guaranteed to get the seats right.
Yeah.
And so to that extent, it's a much more complicated exercise. But the referendum, I mean, in the end, the trouble is, we kind of had the thing up saying what would happen in 50-50, but everybody could work out what Sunderland meant.
Yeah.
And the pound tanked. Sorry, but the pound tanked.
Yeah. I was going to say, did you see what happened to the pound during the night? But you've been quoted as saying that there will be another referendum at some point.
On what?
Another EU referendum.
Yeah, I think the 2016 referendum is going to be as unsuccessful as the 1975 one.
During what sort of timescale, or do you want to hazard a guess?
That depends very much on uncertain politics. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens before 2040.
Really? Blimey. Okay.
Well, I mean, if you look so far at what's happened to attitudes, and if you look at the age profile of attitudes towards Brexit, now you can see why it's. I mean, a lot will also happen about how does our relationship with the EU evolve? To what extent does the next Labour government soften it or not? I mean, but one of the things to realise is that the Labour Party is going to get elected by an electorate which is 3/4 anti-Brexit. I mean, one of the great ironies of the whole situation of where we're at is that the party that's tried the hardest to change the Brexit profile of its support has succeeded the least. Labour's vote is almost as anti-Brexit as it was back in 2019.
Okay.
So therefore, that raises the question, particularly if, as many of us think it's not unlikely that the next new Labour government is going to hit political trouble fairly early on, because it's a terrible, terrible legacy that they're going to inherit. Then they've got to think about ways of how to keep their voters on board. And a lot of their voters would be hoping that the Labour government would do something about the EU, which is perhaps rather more than the Labour Party is currently saying it wants to do on the EU.
But do we know that these people are anti-Brexit in a kind of, I'm not just anti-Brexit, but Brexit is a really important issue for me, or, yeah, I wish we'd voted Remain, but actually I don't really, it's not a fight I'm interested in at the moment, because the salience issue matters, doesn't it?
My answer to you, Anand, is that on all the measures that I can see, people on the Remain side argument are much more emotionally committed to their side, right? So it's the complete opposite of the stereotype. I mean, the claim was it was the Remainers who were the wise intellectuals who knew what they were doing, and the Leavers were the emotional folk who were engaging in a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. It's not true. I mean, this is not true. It is Remainers who are but still the folk are much more strongly committed to their side of the argument. That doesn't mean to say, however, that they're always consistent in their views. And I'm giving a lecture tomorrow at University of Greenwich that will suggest that, you can also see how the softening of Brexit, depending on how it's sold, could also create a certain amount of difficulty for another Labour government as well. But that's another story for another day.
Yeah, OK. I want to turn to talking about this government. And I suppose the first obvious question is, I mean, from where you sit with your expertise on the polls, is there anything Rishi Sunak could or should be doing that would help turn things round? Or is this basically, I mean, the polls have been pretty consistent for a while now.
Yeah, I mean, there are three things that Mr. Sunak has always needed to do. The first is to distance himself as strongly as possible from his two predecessors. Because we are where we are because of his two predecessors, right? It's Johnson and Partygate and trust in the fiscal event. These are the only two things you need to know about this parliament to understand why we are where we are, okay? He made a fundamental mistake in the summer of last year in failing to vote and getting his party to vote for the Privileges Committee report that said that Boris Johnson had misled the House of Commons. Such progress as the Conservatives had made, not that great as it was, in reversing the damage done to Liz Truss was basically thrown away in an instant. The Tory vote very, very clearly fell away after the 17th of June last year. So, and it's only very, very recently that he's begun also to try and distance himself from Truss. And here's his problem, of course. There are lots of people inside the Conservative Party who still like Boris Johnson. There are even still some people inside the Conservative Party who still like Liz Truss. So the internal pressures and the electoral reality, and this is one of the broader problems he faces, are pushing him in two directions. That's number one. Number two, if Jeremy Hunt had come to me and said, John, I found some money down the back of a sofa. What do you think I should do with it? I would say, Jeremy, don't waste it on tax cuts. Settle the junior doctors' strike and do your damnedest to get the waiting times down. Because while there wasn't before last November any relationship between people, amongst Conservative voters, between their attitudes towards the tax and spend and whether they're willing to vote Conservative again.
Okay.
Right, the evidence was already. Once you do the right analysis, you could see what was going to happen. But of course, again, the problem is it's an issue where the Conservative Party finds themselves in what's happened in the last 4 years and their reaction to the last 4 years, and where the public reaction is very different. The existential problem the Conservative Party faces is we're a party of the centre-right. Oh dear, we have just presided over the biggest expansion of the state since 1945. We're down in the polls. So it must be true that the reason why we're down in the polls is because we've not been true to our beliefs. This is not how the public reacted. The fascinating thing about public reactions so far is you do not find in the data evidence of what we call in the trade a thermostatic reaction against the expansion of the state. People have so far not said, hang on, time to get the tax burden down. And it doesn't matter if we don't spend quite so much on health. The reaction is the opposite. And, we won't know the answer to this for 5 years or so. But I certainly think at least a question that now faces us is whether or not the pandemic is going to have the same impact on our attitudes towards the state as the last World War did. In other words, that experience of the pandemic, has it meant that people said, hey, you know what, the state can sometimes be rather important? Now, we won't know the answer to that for quite a while. But certainly, whereas the Conservative Party has reacted against the expansion of the state, the public hasn't, which is why they're misreading the signals, right? And the other thing he needs to do, but of course it's very difficult, much more difficult for him to do, he needs to try and improve the economy as much as possible, improve people's living standards, but then also crucially, and this is the really difficult bit, he also has to be able to claim the credit for that. And one of the problems he faces is that basically, whenever you start talking about the economy now, all the opposition have to do is Liz Truss. End of argument. And it's so difficult for the Conservative Party to escape from that.
Do you think it's fair to compare the mini-budget, say, to Black Wednesday? Because what we saw with Black Wednesday is the Tories lose their reputation for economic confidence. They only actually get it back when Labour lose theirs in 2008. I mean, that's when...
Absolutely. No, I mean, indeed, it's worth bearing in mind that no government that presided over a market crisis since 1945, with the debatable exception of Labour in 1948, has ever survived at the ballot box. Right? You know, 1967 devaluation, 1976 IMF crisis, 1992 Black Wednesday, 2008 financial crash. The problem the Conservatives has is not only did they crash the markets, but they also ended up with a Prime Minister whose ethics ended up being questioned by his own party, and whose government literally collapsed, right? I mean, you know, the last time, it's a very long time since we've literally seen a government collapse internally. This is very, very difficult to escape from. And again, it helps to explain, you know, one has to have sympathy for Sunak, because in a sense, what he's having to try and do, I've already said he needs to distance himself from his two predecessors, but you can still see the difficulty. Because in effect, the message for the Conservative Party now is this. Well, the economy's a wee bit better. We know it's been the worst economic experience of any post-war parliament, but we want you to vote for us because of what's now happening in the last few months, and please forget the previous 4 years. We are now just beginning to reduce the waiting times in the health service. So please vote for us because of that, and ignore the fact that the waiting times have grown enormously in the previous 4 years. Oh, and by the way, immigration has been higher than it ever has been, both legal and illegal, but we're now trying to do something about it, so please vote for us. In other words, and it's very, very difficult for a government to try and campaign against its own record. But that's effectively what it's having to try to do.
On that final point, I mean, how important in the minds of the voters are the issues of immigration and Rwanda?
Again, it's an issue that upsets a lot of Conservative voters, okay? And if you've decided you're going to defect from the Conservatives and you are concerned about immigration, and by the way, if you're a Leaver, you're more likely to go to Reform than you are to go to Labour. That said, however, and I've done this numerous times with numerous data sets, if you first of all take data on whether or not people think immigration's gone up or gone down, okay? And take this data for 2019 Conservative voters, and then look to see, well, what is the probability that they say they will vote Conservative again, and how much does it differ between those who think that immigration's going up and those who don't? And the answer is there's not much difference. Whereas this is why I emphasise the economy and the NHS. If you do the same analysis for the NHS, people who think the NHS is terrible, who voted Conservative in 2019, are much less likely to vote Conservative again than those who think it's doing okay. Those who think the economy is doing badly are much less likely to vote Conservative again than those who are not. So this is why it's that kind of analysis that made me sceptical about tax cuts. And now we'll have to see what happens on immigration. But all that's happened so far basically is that since the government started to focus on immigration, support for reform has gone up. So it's not obvious. Now, the future might be different from the historical record, but the historical record, if you look underneath the bonnet of what's been going on, isn't very encouraging that this is going, even if they do get flights off to Rwanda, it's necessarily going to have that much impact.
And I suppose a slight encouragement for the Conservatives is every by-election reform have underperformed their polling. But given that, how...
But the Conservative Party has still done the polling badly anyway, so it's pretty cold comfort.
But how important do you think reform would be, A, and the follow-on is, what difference would it make if they were led by Nigel Farage, insofar as we can tell?
Well, Farage is obviously an extremely good campaigner, and one of the problems that we have is that none of the mainstream parties, and I include the SNP here, is led by somebody who's particularly good at politics. Right? They're all, at best, modest speakers, They can't do the vision thing. They can't articulate what they're about in clear phrases that makes the public enthusiastic. It's one of the reasons why I think turnout's probably going to be quite low. It's probably going to be a really dull election. Nigel Farage, that's why George Galloway attracts interest, because he's a brilliant campaigner. Farage is a brilliant campaigner. Now, it's quite a while since, hypothetical polling is hypothetical and it should be used carefully. It's quite a while now since anybody has said, well, what would you do if Nigel Farage were leading reform? I think level of support for reform is now already at the level of support it was suggested when that exercise was last done.
Okay.
So maybe now wouldn't have that much impact. Certainly I think what is true is that if the extent to which the Conservative Party can squeeze the reform vote is potentially one of the dynamics between now and the election. Not necessarily because people necessarily lost their dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party, but it's the argument you'll let Labour in. But then equally also, Labour will be looking to squeeze the Green vote as well, which is also, by the way, at a higher level in national polling than it's ever previously been. So there are two possible squeezes going on there, which might counteract each other.
Would Labour be doing better if they were being more ambitious on Europe?
That is difficult to prove. It's certainly true. It's just that Labour have been relatively successful at picking up people who voted Leave in 2016. Right? That's true. But there are then three other things going on. The people who have moved from Conservative to Labour, who voted Leave in 2016, are disproportionately people who now say they'd vote to rejoin. Okay, one. Two, the people whom Labour have picked up, who are new to the election since 2019, i.e. all those young voters, they're all very pro-Remain. And three, those people who voted Labour in 2019, like the public in general, are now about 10% more likely to be in favour of rejoin than they were to vote Remain back in 2016. So in other words, although Labour have made progress amongst people who were 2016 Leave voters, when you actually look at it in terms of current preference, you discover that not much has changed, which is why I said earlier that Labour's voting went down. So in a sense, things have happened despite Labour rather than because Labour. So at the end, I don't think one could argue that what Labour has done them damage. But one of the reasons why I would argue that is true, and this, I think the party that has made a mistake is the Liberal Democrats.
I was about to come on to them, so
I think the Liberal Democrats have made a mistake because in their case, yes, you can show that they've picked up some Leave voters, but they've lost more Remain voters. Oh, and by the way, who have their Remain voters gone to? They've gone to Labour. One of the quiet, dramatic things in all the polling is Liberal Democrats have lost in about one in three of the people who voted for them in 2019 to the Labour Party. And the Liberal Democrats seem completely relaxed about it. Because their whole focus is trying to win Conservative-held seats, and they're not concerned at all about their national share of the vote. But the other side of election, however well they do, they might think they've rather missed an opportunity. But, anyway.
But doesn't that kind of make sense? If you're targeting a certain number of seats with pretty local campaigns, isn't it sensible, particularly after a jarring electoral experience where you come second in loads of seats and end up very, very few MPs, doesn't it make sense for them to target certain seats where they're pretty confident of winning MPs?
Yeah, of course the targeting is fine. But the question is whether that's all you should be doing. Because the risk they're taking, well, first of all, they're betting the farm on the Conservatives doing badly. Yeah. Right? If the Conservatives start to recover in the polls, the Liberal Democrats' prospects in terms of seats will suddenly diminish quite quickly. Point one. Point two, think about it this way. Let's say it works. And the Liberal Democrats, with 10% of the vote, have 30 seats in the House of Commons. They've regained the position as the third party in the House of Commons because the SNP haven't done that well. And then there isn't fratricidal warfare inside the Conservative Party. The Labour government struggles and is rapidly unpopular. And the Conservative Party begins to recover. Lo and behold, you've got 30 MPs up a creek without a paddle. Because the party's own vote's not gone up, they have completely failed to enhance their position and insulate their position against the possibility that the Conservative Party at some point in the future is not going to be as unpopular as it is now. So I think focusing entirely on that, and without also, and in particular, given that you can show that the principal loss of support by the Liberal Democrats is to Labour, you might actually want to attack the Labour Party as well as the Conservative Party, even though you might want to say, well, they're not as bad as the Tories, but you might want to win those voters back. But no apparent effort is being made to do so.
OK, I've got a couple more questions. So in the interim, if you've got a question, just signal to the people with the mics. And if you can keep the questions short so we can rattle through as many as possible, that would be great. I'll ask some of the Slido ones, but a couple of things just to end with. Firstly, you know, Keir Starmer is more popular than Rishi Sunak, but he's not massively popular.
He's not as popular as David Cameron was before 2010, let alone Tony Blair before 1997.
Does that imply...
And he's less popular than his party.
Does that imply anything about how quickly popularity of his government might erode, do you think? Do you think that is something they should be concerned about when they...
I'm not the only person to have said this, so let me just say it briefly. Basically, it looks as though the Labour Party are where they are, not because of Keir Starmer radical transformation of the Labour Party, and essentially because of what I said earlier. It's Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And in other words, he's been a very lucky general. The government have fouled up spectacularly, and also, you know, in fairness to them, have had a rotten hand. It's just they played a rotten hand badly. And that, as a result, people have turned to the Labour Party simply on the basis, they couldn't possibly be any worse than the current lot, could they? But, you know, it's not just the popularity of the leader, it's on measures like, is Labour ready for government? Again, it's much weaker than it was before 1997. I mean, this is, Ipsos are now publicising this more widely, but I first saw some very clever junior researchers at Ipsos do this at a junior conference that the British Polling Council run for junior people in the polling industry. And they did this brilliant presentation. They first of all went through Rishi Sunak's numbers, and they compared Sunak's numbers with previous prime ministers, and basically Rishi Sunak was going to lose on all precedent in terms of where we're at now, right? And they then did the same thing for Starmer. On historical precedent, Starmer is heading to lose as well, right? His numbers are weak. And so one reason for concern is that. The second reason for concern is that the Labour Party is so keen on it. I mean, it seems to be so keen on its Mingva strategy that it isn't necessarily always thinking about what's the best way to position ourselves so that if we are in government, we can deal politically with the situation we are in. And I certainly take the view, for example, that accepting the national insurance tax cut just makes the fiscal position, which is already rotten, even worse. Oh, and by the way, if you read the OBR report, most of that tax cut was unfunded. The line of attack, and the second one at least, was largely unfunded. The line of attack is absolutely perfectly clear. You could argue that it's an unfunded tax cut. But the point is, in accepting that, they are potentially creating a rod for their own back. And it does make it much more difficult if, as is perhaps not unlikely, the Labour government has to increase taxes after the next election. And we know what happens when you promise one thing and do another. So I think the Labour Party also strategically is arguably now too focused on between now and the election, when it might be wise to be more focused on where it's going to be 12 months after the next election.
And a final question about the next election. There's been a lot of talk about this being the election when tactical voting comes into its own and goes mainstream, and that would absolutely trash the Conservatives. What do you... I mean, we've heard this before.
Well, I mean, the answer to you is that if I take the local elections of last year, there are two crucial patterns, both of which were also in evidence in local elections before 1997. The first is that indeed, vote, it's not an enormous number, it's not on the scale in the parliamentary by-elections, but at around the order of 2 or 3% of people are clearly voting for whichever of Labour or the Democrats are better able to defeat the Conservatives locally. And that, by the way, is something that is not at this stage the polls will pick up. Not even the MRP polling will pick that up, because voters only decide to vote tactically quite late. But historical precedent, given last year's local elections, suggests that's not unlikely, and it's one of the things we're very closely looking for in the results a week today. The second thing that was there last year, and this is what the MRP polling is also picking up, and this is why you can get forecasts of 90 seats for the Conservatives, is that the Conservative vote is falling more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Now, this in part is arithmetical inevitability, right? The Conservative vote is down at the moment by 21 points as compared with 2019. There were about 80 constituencies where the Conservatives did not get 21% of the vote in 2019, and therefore their vote cannot fall down by the same absolute amount in every constituency. It's bound to happen more in places. And, you know, the reason why the Tories ended up losing 1,000 seats despite all their kind of obvious expectations that would not happen was indeed because they were losing votes. In fact, they were virtually losing votes almost entirely last year in wards they were trying to defend. So it's not just tactical voting, it's also, does the geography of the Conservative vote become disadvantageous to them? And all I can say to you is that tactical voting happened on quite a substantial scale in 1997. It wouldn't be unprecedented if it were to happen again. But then also we had that geographical pattern, the Tories losing ground more heavily in places they were strongest. That's why the Tories ended up with 165 seats in 1997. And so much of where we're at now is so incredibly similar to 1997.
So it feels like 97 to you?
Except, of course, the economy and the public services are in a far, far worse state.
Yeah. Okay, where are the... who's got a mic? Oh, you've got a mic back there. So, the gentleman over there.
He's going to make you run all the way across to the far end.
No, I'm not, because there's two mics. Yep, off you go.
Here we go. Make it very quickly.
Oh, no, the guy with the mic. We'll get you a mic later. Sorry. Go on,
Hello.
the guy behind you.
Can I just say, Anand and Sir John, that was an electric discussion, and thank you so much. I've got two questions, actually. One's really boring.
That's cheating.
That's cheating.
One's really
I'll forget one of them, so
it's
be
got
careful.
a yes/no answer. Do the Boundary Commission consult psephologists? That's the first one, yes or no?
Sorry,
Do the Boundary Commission consult psephologists?
No.
Fine. Second, what about the mayoral elections that we're facing on the 5th of May? And you haven't said anything about the Hall-Khan vote, and I'd be quite interested in your analysis, if you can give it now, of that particular vote and the impact, for example, of identities, cars.
Okay. I'm very wary of bringing coals to Newcastle. You know, I live in the west of Scotland, and you guys, probably most of you live in London, and you probably know much more about London politics than I do. I will simply observe that whereas 30 years ago, London, in terms of the distribution of party support, was very similar to that of the country as a whole, London is now almost a one-party state. And the Conservatives are only ever going to do well in elections in London now in a very bad year for the Labour Party. This is not a very bad year for the Labour Party. On the other mayoral elections, the two which in a sense matter politically are Tees Valley and the West Midlands, which are the two that the Conservatives currently hold. I have to admit, I thought Ben Houchin was a shoo-in because he got 77% of the vote last time. But we've had a poll which suggested it's neck and neck, so who knows. Andy Street's position, he starts off with a much weaker position than Ben Houchin. We've had two polls now, one of which suggests that Labour are narrowly ahead, and another suggests that Labour are quite well ahead. So both are potentially at risk.
Wasn't there a problem with the latter? Didn't the polling company say with the latter?
Yeah, and I'm quoting the revised figure.
Okay, all right. Ooh, what's this? Okay. That was very exciting. Who wants to go? Can we not have all blokes asking questions? No. Ah, there's a lady here. Thank you, just for me. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know where the mic is. The lady, sorry, Zane, the lady...
Lady in a white jumper.
White, that's the one.
And then we promised the
You don't
gentleman
need
over
me.
here, didn't we?
Do you think there's an appetite in the country for proportional representation?
Interestingly, one of the British social attitudes, we have a question we've been asking ever since the mid-1980s, which is quite a tough one. It basically articulates the arguments on two sides. So do you think that we should change the electoral system so that it's fairer to smaller parties, or should we keep the current system because it ensures that, we have single-party government. And usually that has produced a majority of people in favour of keeping the current system. However, the last time we ran it, we had a majority in favour of PR. And crucially, for the first time, we had a majority of Labour supporters in favour of PR. That said, I hate to tell you, but of course, the Labour Party is now officially in favour of PR, right? But the leader is not. But you know what? I anticipate, as happened after 1997, that if the Labour Party wins a stonking majority, all of a sudden, they will discover the glories of our current electoral system. And it is always parties out of power. On the other hand, look forward to a renewed debate inside the Conservative Party about we should change our electoral system. But, so, I mean, I think, we're only going to end up with a debate on this if at some point we get a minority government which is in ad hoc to the Liberal Democrats. I think the Liberal Democrats now are clear that it's a referendum and it's a referendum on PR and not the nonsense that we had in 2011. But until that happens, it's all terribly interesting. But the test now will be what happens to public opinion if we do indeed get a majority Labour government.
We had a panel at a conference a couple of years ago, and we had Natalie Bennett and Richard Tice on it. And the
they're both in favour.
So my intention was that they'd have an absolute Barney about Brexit. That was why we invited them, that they'd have a fight. And they sat there and had a complete love-in about PR instead. It was appalling to watch. I mean, it was just so... But yeah, very much in favour, right.
Because they both lose out from the current system.
There's a guy here at the front...
Is it possible...
well done.
Is it possible, Sir John, to share your thinking and expand on what you said about the non-vote and any trends?
Non-voters. Are there any trends?
What we can learn from them?
Well, I mean, I think the observation you're referring to is, I mean, I suspect that the turnout in this election will be low. We know
why is that?
Yeah, it's just what I'm going to explain.
All right.
So, we know, two things we know from history. One is that if the parties are thought to be close together, people are less likely to turn out and vote because it doesn't seem to matter so much. And the parties are relatively close together at present.
Oh, so close together ideologically?
Yeah,
all right. I thought you meant,
sure,
okay.
And secondly, if at the same time it looks to be all over by the shouting, people go, what's the point? We know who's going to win, and it's not going to make any difference. To that, at this election, is added what I was also referring to, which is that we've got to... I mean, I've kind of gone back in my mind. I think this is the first time since 1945 that all of the parties are led by somebody who's pretty dull and doesn't excite the electorate. I mean, if you think about it, at least there was always Jeremy Thorpe, right? I mean, the Liberal Democrats at least nearly always, or the Liberal Party before then, because it seemed to be essential to them, had a leader who was charismatic, could reach out to the wider public. None of them can at the moment. It's a remarkably weak bunch on that criterion. I mean, they have many other skills, I should say, right? Rishi Sunak loves a spreadsheet. That's just not make you a good politician. Sir Keir Starmer is brilliant at filleting other people's arguments. But your job as leader is to come up with your own argument, and that's more difficult. Ed Davey is very nice. He clearly looks after his disabled son extremely well, but his game doesn't attract public attention. And Humza Yousaf, nice chap, no charisma. And none of them have succeeded in articulating a vision.
Who does low turnout help, do you think?
Doesn't make any difference, because I suspect, one suspects it wouldn't be surprised if Tory voters are somewhat more likely to stay at home just simply because so many of them are disenchanted, but therefore just find it easy to stay at home.
And does the polling make a difference? So, I mean, if people suddenly say, oh my God, Labour are going to win by a landslide, we don't want a landslide, does that alter perception?
The answer to it that is, it's now quite old, but there is a lovely academic article in academic journal. Occasionally academic articles are worth reading, by the way. And this one is lovely because it basically shows that for every election in which there was a so-called bandwagon effect where voters seemingly, the lead of the party in the head of the polls expanded. There's another one that has the reverse effect. So basically there's no firm rule.
Okay.
What shifts the polls are arguments and events.
Sir John, you're a fascinating individual, and I'd like to ask a question about you. You bring to mind a wizard, perhaps Gandalf, who exists in dark spaces and finds out mysterious things and comes out and tells the world what will happen. But even Gandalf chose a side. He chose between Sauron and the hobbits.
Could you make it quick, please? We've got loads of other people waiting.
Okay. Without asking which way, are you, in your position, able to take a political position for yourself?
I try very, very hardly always to be impartial. Most of my answers are on the one hand and on the other hand, because a party's position is never 100% secure. And in particular, and I'm not going to tell you more than this, but I am particularly keen to test either things that I've said before to check they're still true, or the evidence for anything where, I might think privately, that's a rather good thing. Those are the things that, above all, you need to make sure that you've tested the evidence as much as you can, and to look for anything that might raise a question mark about basically your prior dispositions. And that's how I operate.
But you occasionally get into fights with the party. I remember back in the Hartlepool by-election, that weekend of the local elections, the Labour Party got quite
it was 2022 the Labour Party were upset.
Yeah.
Because they felt that, basically we cut across their narrative. I mean, one of our jobs on election night is that, politicians will always claim, we've done brilliantly, or, well, look at the result in Tinbridge. We've done brilliantly in Tinbridge. Ignore the rest of the country. We've done brilliantly in Tinbridge, right? Et cetera, et cetera. They will always cherry pick.
Yeah.
And our job is to, sometimes it's to agree with the narrative. I think last year, actually, for the most part, we raised a few questions. Certainly in recent parliamentary by-elections, there's been no way you could say anything other the Labour Party have done well. You just can't gainsay it, right? But that in the 2022 elections, the Labour Party, I think the thing they really didn't like is that we gently pointed out that their performance wasn't actually any better than that of Jeremy Corbyn in his first year of local elections. And shall we say, that kind of put salt into the wound. But the point is, our job there is to try to give the viewer or the listener an honest account of what we think the evidence is. And that will sometimes, therefore, mean that we are challenging the spin on the results that the party are coming up with. In a sense that I almost take that to be part of our job. So we're not necessarily in an adversarial relationship with the political parties, but we are certainly in a critical relationship, and we always have to be.
Oh, you've been waiting for ages, haven't you? There's a guy at the front in the brown coat. My eyesight is so... Oh, they're ignoring me. OK.
Hi. My question is, how important do you think the younger vote will be in this next election?
Well, the short answer to is the Labour Party is overwhelmingly popular amongst younger people. The question is how many of them turn out to vote. I'm afraid, it is one of the almost iron laws of psephology is that younger people are less likely to vote. It's just that eventually they grow up and they become more likely to vote. So the question is how many of them turn out to vote. And of course the age profile means they're by a relatively small section of the electorate by some historical standards.
There's loads of questions on here about what impact you think voter ID might have on turnout.
This is a difficult subject. Of course, the statistical analysis was done at the last local elections, and the proportion of people who are known to have turned up, been turned away, and failed to come back again was, a very small proportion. All right? So, but of course, the argument then is, but what about the people who never got to being refused because they went to the door and they were advised, you haven't got your ID, so you won't be able to vote. And that has just created uncertainty, which has enabled those on both sides of the argument to...
Yeah.
Right. Now, I have to say on this subject, I am probably in a minority, but partly because I have some experience of the international observation elections. Basically, not requiring people to provide ID means that we're not up to what are normally recognised international standards. The problem, of course, we have, however, as a country is that we don't have ID cards. If we had ID cards, there's no argument. And then, of course, what is true is that, shall we say, it is perhaps not unreasonable to argue that there's been a somewhat seemingly selective, a somewhat unquestionable selection made of the forms of ID that we're willing to accept. And I think certainly that's unfortunate. And to be honest, in an ideal world, what would have happened is that this is one of those things that would have been done on a cross-party basis. It would have been an understanding that maybe if we're going to maintain OECD standards, we perhaps ought to do something. We've already done it in Northern Ireland for quite a while, where there was evidence of corruption. It's true, there isn't much evidence here, and postal voting is arguably much more of a problem. But if you're going to argue that there is an international case for doing something about it, it would be much better done on a bipartisan basis with an agreement about what the forms of ID should be.
Last year, on the day of the local elections, I was absolutely chuffed with myself because I picked up my passport, sent a WhatsApp of myself holding it to the whole team saying, I remembered, walked down to the polling station, and we weren't having bloody local elections where I live, so it was a complete farce.
No. But you do this year, I think. Yeah.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. How important will the expatriate vote be? Given, especially, one assumes it's quite important, given the extraordinary amount of time and money that the Conservatives have spent on trying to gather it.
The question was how important the expat vote will be.
Right. The history of this is, sorry, I won't be able to quote the numbers off the top of my head, but the history of this, of course, is, so what's happened for everybody is that now, it doesn't matter how long you've been out of the country, you can claim the right to vote. And this is something that the Conservative Party has pursued. The truth is that, and in principle, it's whatever it is it 2 million people who are thought to have the right, potentially the right to vote, whatever the number is. The truth is, in practice, the number of people who avail themselves of it has historically been very low. It got a substantial boost at the time of Brexit, surprise, surprise, the Brexit referendum, but since then it's been falling off again. So I think at the moment it's, 80, 90,000 people on the register, question mark. And then, of course, while it might once have been true that people who are British citizens living abroad might have been more likely to vote for the Conservative Party, not entirely obvious anymore that that's going to be true, at least for those living inside the European Union. So probably not going to, I mean, A, how many, there aren't probably going to be that many of them, and B, I mean, I suspect they'll be quite divided in terms of how they vote. But in the end of the day, none of us know, because nobody has any reliable data on the voting preferences of expats.
Oh, you've got it. Brilliant, fantastic. Despite me, well done.
How do you expect, how do you think the Lib Dems may fare in their by-election gains, and with Caroline Lucas standing down, how the Greens may fare in Brighton Pavilion?
The Liberal Democrats must have a pretty good chance of hanging on quite a few of the by-elections. Some of them perhaps, I mean, I guess North Shropshire might be regarded as the most difficult one to defend, just simply because there is absolutely no prior evidence of it being Liberal Democrat territory, whereas Tiverton and Honiton, yes, Cheshire. Some of us mentioned, when the late 8 MP for Cheshire and Amersham died, some of us, unfortunately, widely respected across the House. Some of us went, that's a Liberal Democrat banker, because it's it was a Remain voting seat. But so long as the Conservative Party remains as unpopular as they are, they've probably got a pretty good chance of hanging on to most of them. Are you asking about, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in Brighton?
Well, you should.
Unforecastable. I so you asked me earlier about the difference between commentary and analysis, right?
Okay, touche.
If I do not have evidence, I am happy to say so.
Okay, fair enough.
Hi, just to go back to your point about the voter turnout amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, which is the lowest turnout in any age group, do you think automatic voter registration, not compulsory voting, but automatic voter registration would help in removing some of the barriers towards that generation voting? And do you think it would improve voter turnout?
So and hang on, can I do a follow-up, which is let's add a compulsory voting to that?
Okay, so what do you mean by automatic voter registration?
I mean that it's... Oh God, I should really know this. I work for a company that does this. You are automatically put on the register as soon as you turn 16 in Scotland, 18 in England and Wales. Well, no, sorry, not Wales anymore. 18 in England, and it's linked to the data associated with your national insurance number, cross-checked and cross-referenced with your bills, your university address, if you go to a university or higher education.
Yeah, the difficult bit, of course, and it's one of the reasons why this age group doesn't end up being on the register in some cases, is because they're heavily geographically mobile. And not even the DWP will necessarily know where they live. And of course, you're meant to be registered at where they are. I mean, so, the reason why young people don't vote, I mean, it's a combination of circumstance and motivation. Few of them have the motivation, but it's also true they are more likely to be in the circumstances living in, single rooms, multi-occupancy occupation, geographically mobile, perhaps a somewhat higher level of unemployment. These are all the things that are associated the people not getting on the register. There is obviously, I thought this is the reason why I asked you the question, there is obviously an argument about whether or not universities should be allowed once more to automatically register students who are living in their halls of residence, although of course many fewer universities these days run their own halls of residence, so that wouldn't necessarily have the impact that it once did. The problem is, again, we don't have a population register, right? So therefore, we don't necessarily know where everybody lives, etc., etc. And then you have to ask yourself, which is the greatest sin? The sin of people not being on the electoral register, or what for some people is the sin of compulsory ID cards. Compulsory voting, definitely not. I think it's the right of the public to say, yeah, none of you are any good. Yeah, none of you, I think, are worth my shoe leather of turning up, and it's a crucial signal to our politicians when that happens. I
can't see the back of the room, but everyone's waving at me, so I think there's a lady there. Yes. It might be the final question, actually, because I know you've got to get off.
Yeah. Just a brief question. Have you worked on foreign policy's effect on voter attitudes, and do you think...
Sorry, can you say that again?
Have you ever worked on foreign policy, like how
voter attitudes to foreign policy?
Voter attitudes, and in this current atmosphere, do you think it's going to affect...
Will foreign policy have an impact on how people vote? Is that...
Okay, yeah. Sure. Well, Brexit did last time, and that's arguably a foreign policy issue. Brexit was the central issue in 2019. I guess you're alluding to the divisions over the Middle East. Foreign policy over Ukraine, no. There's no dispute. Public opinion on this in this country is overwhelmingly in favour of some support for Ukraine, perhaps unlike the United States. The Middle East is where there is division because, most voters, you should say straight away, either say don't know or they're equally sympathetic to both sides. But amongst those who express a view, Conservative voters are more likely to say they're sympathetic to Israel, and you see that being reflected in the House of Commons, and Labour supporters are more likely to say they're sympathetic to Palestine, and that latter number has increased. The last one I saw, it was nearly 50%. The question is, however, is if you are upset about Labour's stance on Palestine, where are you going to go? Now, maybe you go to the Greens. But, fundamental difference in the position over the Iraq War is on the Iraq War, Charles Kennedy came out against the Iraq War from the beginning. And there is no doubt that as a result in the 2005 election, the Liberal Democrats picked up an awful lot of Muslim votes. Despite Layla Moran, the Liberal Democrats have not taken an avowedly different stance. So that's point one. Point two, of course, is that for the most, even if some... obviously there's the possibility that there will be some independent, Muslim stroke pro-Palestinian candidates, etc., etc. The problem is that the places where they're likely to do well, most of them are places where even in 2019 it was a safe Labour seat. So I can well envisage Labour there are good reasons anyway to anticipate that Labour's vote is not going to advance strongly in places where they're previously stronger. But maybe that would be particularly true in places with large numbers. To be honest, one of the other things we'll be looking out for from the local election results on Thursday, because a lot of them are in urban areas, for whether or not actually we get harder evidence on this than we've got so far.
All right, look, I'm afraid I'm going to have to be utterly brutal about time because John's got to run up to do Peston, so you can see him again if you get home by 9 o'clock. But before you go, we have to do this. We do a quick fire round.
All right, OK.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
One answer or the other, OK? No hesitations. Swingometer or exit poll?
Exit poll. Polling
station or postal vote?
Postal vote.
Glasgow or Edinburgh?
I live in Glasgow.
You know, as a fudge. Rugby or football?
Football.
Good for you. Radio or podcast?
Oh. I spend a lot of time listening to the radio.
OK. EU or US?
Ah, that's too political.
OK. Coke or Iron Brew? That's quite political.
Coke.
Good answer. Hotel or Airbnb?
Hotel.
I know this one. Sleeper train or aeroplane?
Sleeper.
Greggs or Pret?
Pret.
Dear. Tea or coffee?
Both.
Wine or beer?
Wine.
Maths or English?
English.
UK in a changing Europe or NatSen?
No comment.
Thank you. John Curtice, thank you very, very much indeed.